In the shadowy stillness beneath the surface of deep waters, there are things that most people never see, things that defy explanation and evoke a primal fear. This video delves into 3 of the most disturbing underwater incidents imaginable. The first story begins in Belgium, in a place both beautiful and quietly ominous. What happened here in the early days of 2024 would leave a lasting impression on anyone who dared to dive too deep. The Plate Taille Reservoir, located in southern Belgium, had long captivated the local diving community. It was a place of paradox, a tranquil, picturesque landscape above, with thick forests and rolling hills hugging its shores, and an eerie, forgotten world hidden beneath. This artificial lake, the largest of its kind in Belgium, was created when the dam was completed in the 1970s. As the waters rose, they submerged roads, buildings, and remnants of old villages, preserving them in cold silence. For divers, the reservoir offered a rare and haunting glimpse into a drowned past. Its submerged structures and poor visibility created an environment that was both challenging and deeply alluring. On January 4, 2024, 2 experienced divers, Christophe, age 46, and Frederick, age 59, arrived at the site, their vehicle packed meticulously with equipment. Both men were seasoned veterans of the sport, well aware of the hazards that came with deep dives and low-visibility waters. That particular evening was bleak. The sky was heavy with clouds, and recent rainfall had stirred the reservoir into a murky swirl. Still, the men were not discouraged. This was their first dive of the new year, a ritual of sorts, a way to shake off the lethargy of winter and reconnect with the world beneath the surface. To them, it was just another routine outing in a familiar location. They had the training, the right equipment, including rebreathers and underwater propulsion vehicles, and the quiet confidence of men who had done this many times before. But what awaited them below was anything but routine. The Plate Taille Reservoir spans 865 acres and is part of a network of 5 interconnected lakes. At its heart stands the Plate Taille Dam, a colossal concrete structure stretching 790 meters in length. It houses a pump storage hydroelectric power station, an essential piece of Belgian infrastructure. But beneath the waterline, the dam hides something far more sinister, a network of deep intake tunnels that feed water into the turbines. These tunnels are vast and powerful, reaching depths of 50 to 70 meters when the turbines are active. They generate an immense suction, strong enough to draw in anything that comes too close. For divers, these intake tunnels are a known danger, a forbidden zone that demands caution and respect. When the turbines are running, the deep hum of machinery vibrates through the water, a low, haunting warning that danger is near. Most divers stayed well above the danger zone, rarely descending past 20 meters, but the true risk lay not just in depth but in proximity. Stray too close to the intake tunnels, and even the strongest swimmer wouldn't stand a chance. The force generated by the dam's turbines is overwhelming, and once caught in that pull, there's no escape. As dusk began to fall on that cold January evening, Christophe and Frederick finalized their preparations. At exactly 5 p.m., they entered the water, disappearing beneath the surface with the assistance of their propulsion vehicles. The reservoir was cold and visibility was poor, just a few feet at best. But again, these were familiar conditions for the 2 divers. They had likely mapped out their dive in advance, relying on their experience and instinct to carry them safely through the depths. At first, everything went as expected. The dive began smoothly, with the men following their intended path. But at some point during their descent, they began to drift. Whether due to the disorienting conditions, the low visibility, or a slight miscalculation, they unknowingly veered off course. In the silence and shadows of the reservoir, they crossed an invisible boundary. Without realizing it, they entered the danger zone, the area near the intake tunnels of the dam, where the water becomes treacherous. Those familiar with the lake speak of an unspoken rule: never approach the intake area when the turbines are active. That night, however, that rule was broken, perhaps unknowingly. The reasons remain unclear. The hum of their dive propulsion vehicles may have masked the deeper vibration of the turbines. The murky water may have obscured visual landmarks. Or it could have been a simple error in navigation. Whatever the cause, Christophe and Frederick slipped too close to the tunnels. And then something changed. The current, previously gentle and manageable, began to shift. At first, the force increased subtly, just enough to signal that something wasn't right. Then it intensified rapidly. In a matter of seconds, the divers found themselves caught in a current far stronger than they had anticipated. Their propulsion vehicles were no match for the force pulling them in. Panic may have set in, but there was little time to react. The suction from the intake tunnel was now overwhelming, powered by the spinning turbines deep within the dam. In an instant, control was gone. The water dragged them forward with brutal strength, and there was no way to resist. Christoph and Frederick were pulled into the darkness, consumed by a force no diver could survive. What began as a routine dive ended in a horrifying, irreversible moment, a fatal encounter with one of the reservoir's most feared dangers. In an instant, two experienced divers, Christoph and Frederick, went from calmly exploring the still waters of a Belgian reservoir to being caught in a deadly current, one they never had a chance of escaping. Beneath the surface, they were pulled with incredible force toward an industrial turbine system, designed to move millions of gallons of water with ease. By the time either man realized what was happening, the situation was already beyond saving. Hours passed beyond the expected end of their dive. Frederick's son, growing increasingly anxious, decided to drive to the Plate Taya reservoir. What he found there only deepened his worry, vehicles still parked in the lot, untouched since arrival. Night had fallen and there was no sign of the two divers. At first, hope lingered, perhaps they had simply extended the dive, lost track of time. But as the minutes stretched into hours, that hope began to fade. A call was made and within hours, a full-scale search and rescue operation was underway. The next day, 10 professional divers entered the water, backed by sonar equipment. A helicopter scanned from above using a thermal imaging camera. But conditions were brutal. Heavy rainfall in the days prior had stirred the sediment, leaving the water murky and visibility close to zero. The surface current was strong, but below it was worse. Even expert recovery divers struggled to remain stable against the pull. By the night of January 5th, more than 24 hours since Christoph and Frederick had submerged, the first breakthrough came. Dive equipment was found scattered in the water, an oxygen tank, a vest, pieces of gear that should have remained secured to the divers' bodies. Their separation told a grim story, something catastrophic had happened. Attention quickly turned to a specific location, downstream, near the dam's massive turbines. It was believed that if the divers had been pulled in, their remains would likely be found beyond the intake system. And at 12:30 p.m. on January 6th, divers made a tragic discovery near the base of the dam. One body was recovered, but its condition was such that immediate identification was not possible. Hours later, a second body was located nearly a mile downstream, washed up along the banks. Their equipment, rebreathers, propulsion vehicles, and more had been torn apart by an immense force. Autopsies later confirmed what searchers had feared. The remains were those of Christoph and Frederick. The conclusion was inescapable. The men had been drawn too close to the turbine intake system, where the sudden and overwhelming force of the current pulled them in. It wasn't just a tragic diving accident, it was a textbook case of Delta P. Delta P, or differential pressure, is a hidden hazard that haunts divers across the globe. Unlike a visible current or entanglement, Delta P offers no warning. It's created when two bodies of water exist at vastly different pressures, separated by an opening. The high-pressure water rushes to equalize with the low-pressure side, creating a silent but violent flow. It's invisible, immediate, and nearly always fatal. Divers caught in a Delta P zone are often pinned in place, compressed against pipes, tunnels, or intakes with crushing force. They rarely have time to react. And in this case, at the Plate Taya Dam, 2 out of 3 turbines were active, pulling millions of gallons of water through the intake. From the surface it looked peaceful. There were no ripples, no disturbances. But underwater, an invisible killer was waiting. Once the divers drifted too close to that zone, their propulsion gear was no match for the suction. Rebreathers and tanks were shattered, equipment torn apart as they were dragged into the heart of the intake system. By the time they registered the danger, they were already gone. Whether Christoph and Frederick knew the turbines were running, or if they underestimated their range, remains unknown. But what's certain is this: they passed a threshold few ever survive. The recovery divers who followed in the days after reported feeling that same pull, strong, relentless, even in controlled conditions. Tragically, their story is not unique. Around the world, Delta P incidents continue to claim the lives of even the most seasoned divers. Often unmarked, sometimes underestimated, these hazards lurk in plain sight. And once you're in their grasp, there is no coming back. The second story begins in September of 1954, when construction commenced on the USS Spiegel Grove, when the massive vessel first took shape in the shipyards. 2 years later, in 1956, it officially entered service with the United States Navy. Measuring a formidable 510 feet from stem to stern and weighing in at 6,900 tons, the ship was an imposing sight on the water. Over the course of its military career, the Spiegel Grove served with honor, participating in numerous missions and operations until it was finally decommissioned in 1989. From that point on, it sat idle in Virginia, a silent relic of Cold War-era power, slowly succumbing to the elements as barnacles and rust began to claim its hull. The Navy, unsure of what to do with the aging ship, let it linger in limbo until a new purpose emerged. Nearly 5 decades after her first deployment, the Spiegel Grove was given a second life. In a bold and innovative move, officials decided to transform the vessel into an artificial reef. The ship was towed from Virginia to South Florida, where it underwent an extensive decontamination process costing over $1 million. The goal was to ensure it would be safe for marine life and divers alike. Then, on Friday, May 17, 2002, the ship was transported by tugboat to a designated marine sanctuary roughly 6 miles off the coast of Key Largo. Once the ship reached the precise drop point, the crew released a 12-ton anchor and began the process of flooding the bow tanks with seawater, gradually sending the vessel to the ocean floor. Within weeks, the Spiegel Grove was opened to the public, and interest from the diving community was immediate and overwhelming. In the first week alone, over 1,000 divers descended into the waters to explore the newly submerged colossus. Over time, the wreck became one of South Florida's most popular underwater destinations, a haven for marine life and a playground for divers seeking adventure beneath the waves. The upper deck, resting just 60 feet below the surface, provided a safe and scenic area for casual divers. But for those with advanced certifications, the ship's interior offered a more dangerous and alluring challenge, a vast, silt-filled labyrinth of darkened rooms, twisting passageways and hidden compartments. In March of 2007, 4 friends from New Jersey, Jonathan, Scott, Kevin, and Howard, embarked on a long-awaited diving trip to the Florida Keys. These men had known each other for years and shared a common passion for the ocean. Each of them was a certified penetration diver, trained and cleared to explore the interior of sunken ships like the Spiegel Grove. However, even with such qualifications, there are areas of wrecks that remain too hazardous to enter, sections where visibility can vanish in seconds, and orientation becomes a matter of instinct rather than memory. The friends knew this, but they also trusted in their experience. On Thursday, March 15th, the group completed a dive at the wreck without incident. The water was warm and inviting, the visibility excellent, and the marine life vibrant. It was everything they had hoped for. Encouraged by the success of the day, the group planned a more ambitious penetration dive for the following morning. Confident in their familiarity with the ship and the route they would take, they made the decision to forego some of the more cumbersome safety equipment. No extra oxygen tanks, no guideline reels, just the essentials. They believed their preparation and experience would be enough. On Friday morning, they suited up, ran through their final checks, and slipped beneath the surface. As they descended through the clear blue water, everything seemed to go according to plan. They entered the wreck in single file, but almost immediately, Howard began to feel uneasy. Something about the interior felt unfamiliar. Despite having been inside before, the environment seemed altered somehow, more complex, more disorienting. Still, the group pressed forward, relying on the assumption that they could always retrace their path to safety if needed. Their journey took them deeper into the ship, eventually leading them to the pump room, located roughly 135 feet below the surface. There they encountered thick, dark silt blanketing the floor. As they hovered to survey the area, Howard noticed his oxygen levels dropping. He signaled to the others that he needed to return to the surface, motioning toward the exit they had entered through. Strangely, the others didn't follow. When Howard gestured toward the way out, they simply shook their heads. Their faces revealed only the faintest hints of concern, but it was enough to spark a sense of urgency. In that moment of hesitation, everything changed. Their movement through the confined space stirred the silt into the water, and within seconds, visibility dropped to near zero. The once clear environment transformed into a blinding fog of sediment. This is a known risk during penetration dives, one that can quickly turn deadly. Disorientation set in. Howard still believed he could find the exit. Trusting his internal compass, he reached out, grabbed the hand of one of the other divers, and began guiding them towards safety. But the diver resisted, yanking his hand free. Then, without a word, all 3 of Howard's friends turned and began swimming in the opposite direction, deeper into the wreck. Howard hesitated. Everything inside him wanted to follow, but something told him that path led only to danger. He was sure they were heading the wrong way. Torn between loyalty and survival, he made the agonizing decision to turn back alone. He retraced the route they'd entered, navigating by instinct and memory, and eventually emerged from the wreck. Upon reaching the surface, he managed to get the attention of a crewman aboard a nearby dive boat. But even then he had no idea just how bad things had become. Unbeknownst to Howard, Kevin had also managed to escape the ship. However, something had gone wrong during his ascent. By the time he reached the surface, he was unconscious. Emergency responders rushed him to the hospital, but it was too late. Kevin was pronounced dead later that day. Even more distressing, Jonathan and Scott were still missing. The Coast Guard responded swiftly, closing the wreck to the public while a rescue team prepared to search for the remaining 2 divers. It's unclear how much time passed before the divers re-entered the water, but everyone involved knew it was no longer a rescue mission, it was recovery. Guided by Howard's account, the team descended into the wreck and headed straight for the pump room. The silt had begun to settle, but the water was still murky when they found the bodies of Jonathan and Scott in a small compartment just off the main chamber. Tragically, they were less than 100 feet from the exit. The following day, Saturday, March 17th, the wreck was closed once again. By 4 p.m., both bodies had been recovered. Investigators later confirmed what had already become clear. The men had become lost in the darkness, their air supplies exhausted, and they had drowned. The lead investigator noted that the group might have survived had they used basic safety protocols, guideline reels, additional oxygen. But without them they were vulnerable, and in the end only Howard survived. Since that harrowing day in 2007, the Spiegel Grove has claimed more lives. 3 additional divers have died exploring its depths. As of today, a total of 10 people have lost their lives in the wreck since it was opened to the public as an artificial reef in June of 2002, a grim reminder of the dangers that lurk beneath the surface, and how quickly a moment of confidence can become a fight for survival. The final story is about Chris Lemons, a man who never saw himself as extraordinary. Born and raised in Edinburgh, Chris considered himself an entirely ordinary person with a job that was just slightly out of the ordinary. Years earlier, at the age of 19, he was uncertain about his future. Life felt directionless and he didn't know what path to take. But then an unexpected opportunity arrived when a friend's father offered him a job aboard a diving vessel. Initially, Chris thought of it as just a summer job to earn some money while figuring out his future. However, this seemingly small decision would end up changing the course of his life. It was aboard that first vessel that Chris was introduced to the specialized and relatively unknown world of saturation diving. Saturation divers live and work at extreme depths underwater, often on oil rigs and deep-sea cables. The conditions are so extreme that divers need specialized gas mixtures carefully managed to prevent serious issues. This dangerous yet fascinating world captivated Chris. Saturation diving wasn't something he had ever planned on doing until he learned about it and saw the respect these divers commanded among the rest of the crew. After completing the necessary training and certifications, Chris found himself living in pressurized chambers aboard ships, descending hundreds of feet into the ocean inside diving bells. These small metal chambers became part of his daily routine, as familiar as commuting to work. He felt an unexpected sense of comfort in the dive bell, tethered to safety by the umbilical cable that provided air, warmth, communication, and a route back to safety. At some point in his career, Chris found himself working aboard the Bibi Topaz, a vessel stationed over oil rigs 100 kilometers northeast of Aberdeen. The North Sea conditions were harsh, with brutal winds and massive waves on the surface, and total darkness below. On September 18, 2012, Chris and fellow divers, Dave and Duncan, prepared for what seemed like just another routine dive at the Huntington oil field. Duncan, the most experienced among them and a mentor to Chris, made it into the dive bell, while Chris and Dave descended nearly 300 feet to repair a pipe on an underwater manifold, a large yellow structure used by the oil industry. The weather was challenging, with winds gusting to 35 knots and swells reaching 18 feet, but this was considered typical for the North Sea and didn't threaten to cancel the dive. Down at 300 feet, however, things were calm and quiet. Chris couldn't help but notice that visibility was better than usual. For about an hour, they worked comfortably with the dive bell visible above them. But suddenly, an alarm blared through their helmets, interrupting their work. Though alarms were common, this one was different. The dive superior's voice over the speakers was urgent and chilling. "Leave everything there. Get out of the structure, boys." Chris and Dave immediately dropped their equipment and rushed toward the dive bell. But when they emerged from the work site, the bell had vanished. Unbeknownst to them, a critical failure in the ship's dynamic positioning system had caused the Topaz to drift uncontrollably, pulling the dive bell with it. Chris and Dave were stranded in the pitch-black waters of the North Sea, hundreds of feet below the surface. Panic set in as Chris realized the horrifying situation. As the dive bell drifted away, the umbilical cable holding Chris was yanked taut, then violently snagged on the metal manifold. Trapped by the relentless pull of the drifting ship, Chris began fighting to free himself, fearing he would be dragged through the narrow openings of the manifold like being forced through a cheese grater. Just as suddenly as it began, the pulling stopped momentarily, sparing him from that nightmare, but Chris knew the danger wasn't over. Dave, realizing what was happening, looked at Chris but was helpless, as his own umbilical was pulling him toward the ship and away from his friend. In the next instant, the force became too much and Chris' umbilical snapped, with a violent crack underwater. He plummeted down to 100 meters or 330 feet, into complete darkness, in freezing waters at just 37 degrees Fahrenheit, with no air supply. For emergencies, saturation divers wear a backup gas tank, which can be turned on with the flip of a switch. In his panic, Chris managed to activate the emergency gas, but it wouldn't last long. If he was lucky, it would last about 9 minutes. Disoriented, Chris fought to find his bearings in the pitch-black water and stumbled into the manifold. Grabbing it as his lifeline, he realized he was completely alone, stranded at the bottom of the North Sea. As the minutes passed, thoughts of his fiancée and their future together filled his mind. They had planned to marry the following year and were building a home together, but Chris knew he would never be part of that life. As he began to lose consciousness, he resigned himself to his fate, the seconds ticking away with his diminishing air supply. On the surface, the crew of the Topaz fought desperately against time. They believed Chris was already lost but still made a monumental effort to regain control of the drifting ship. Miraculously, the dynamic positioning system was restored, allowing the ship to maneuver back toward the dive site. Duncan, waiting in the dive bell, saw Dave reappear, and the two briefly discussed the situation. Dave then prepared to descend again, expecting it to be a recovery mission. Descending into the water, Dave returned to the manifold, bracing himself for the worst. After just a few minutes, he found Chris' lifeless body on top of the structure. With great effort, he hauled Chris back to the dive bell, where, against all odds, Duncan gave him 2 quick rescue breaths. To their astonishment, Chris responded. He gasped and coughed, coming back to life. Chris had survived 35 minutes without breathable air at the bottom of the North Sea. Miraculously, just minutes later, all 3 divers were safely inside a pressurized chamber aboard the Topaz. Medical experts were stunned by Chris' survival. Despite being without air for more than half an hour, he showed no signs of brain damage or physical harm. Chris later theorized that the extreme cold of the water may have slowed his bodily functions enough to protect his vital organs. The oxygen-rich gas he had been breathing before the accident might have helped preserve his tissues. He sought answers by attending medical conferences and consulting experts, but the mystery of how he survived remains unsolved. Incredibly, just 3 weeks after his near-death experience, Chris returned to diving. Soon after, he married his fiancée, though they eventually parted ways. They had 2 children, and Chris devoted his life to raising them. In 2019, his remarkable story was documented in the feature-length film, The Last Breath, which includes interviews, dramatic reconstructions, and actual footage from the diving vessel. Today, Chris continues to work in one of the most dangerous and fascinating professions on Earth, at the bottom of the ocean. If you're interested in more stories like this and want to see more content on our channel, don't forget to subscribe and give this video a like. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video.